we can take the best of this place and adapt it, right? So to me, was a great example of like taking futures thinking, helping us like step 20 or 30 years forward, but then like bringing it back and kind of applying it to today and rooting it in your place.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast, where we explore sustainable placemaking, climate action in cities, and urban rewilding. I'm your host, Ross O'Kelly, an urban designer, educator, and sustainable placemaking consultant. Hello and welcome back. Today's episode is a conversation with Rosanna and Domenica from Place Bureau.
I'm Rosanna Vitiello. I'm the founder and the bureau chief here at the Place Bureau. And I'll tell you a little bit about the studio. We're a studio dedicated to defining new futures and new frontiers for places around the world. And we've been working over the last year with Domenica, Landin, who's here with us today as well.
So my name is Domenica. I'm a design researcher, and my focus within design is with the aim of promoting socio-ecological transformations. I've been working as a researcher for the Place Bureau.
In today's episode, we talk about how to meaningfully engage communities with the future of their places, particularly in response to climate change and climate adaptation. We talk about the Collaborative Place Futures Toolkit, which is a practical tool that Place Bureau have developed for engaging communities in this practice. A little bit more specifically, we talk about how coastal communities can create positive plans for the future in response to rising sea levels, and we talk about potential futures for nature in our cities. Finally, we discuss their book Natural Futures, which explores the future of human-nature interactions in an era of change. It's a really rich discussion. I found it very refreshing and eye-opening, and although it is at times philosophical, it's also very practical, and I think will inspire you to think about how you engage with communities in your own work. Enjoy the conversation. So yeah, just to start, tell us a little bit more about the Place Bureau. What sort of work do you do? What's your purpose, basically?
Yeah, sure. So our focus is really on creating kind of collaborative visions for the future of places. And what that often means, interestingly, is we start not necessarily by looking at the future, but looking at kind of what's there right now. So we have been over the last couple of years developing an approach to place futures, which kind of takes the best of both worlds. So often the idea of like foresight and speculative design thinks very big, thinks about big global drivers. And that's fantastic because it helps you understand, from a green urbanist, let's say, perspective, how planetary sort of changes and shifts, societal changes and shift might impact what you're doing. But one thing that it doesn't do is the place and placemaking, which is kind of our origin, let's say, is very rooted, right? It's very rooted and it starts to look at, we look at the idea, for instance, of placemaking as being meaning making. And so often that's about understanding people's emotional connection to place, the history of the place and how that kind of manifests, the life story of the place. And so what we do with our approach to place futures is help people create those future visions collectively by taking a better understanding of kind of what's there on the ground and combining that with a better understanding of where the world is headed. And we do that with sometimes very large groups of people. So to give you a little flavor, over the last year, Domenica and I worked on this together. We've been working with the Crown Estate to develop a 100-year vision for them for a garden community project that they've been working on in East Hemel. We've also been working in Peterborough, in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, I should say, the entire region in the east of the UK, again, to develop a future vision that's a shared ambition. And that draws in hundreds of different stakeholders and voices beyond the traditional realm, let's say, of urbanism. And we've also been working down in the city of Southampton in the UK to help them develop a vision for the future of their city. Again, drawing on everything from the university team to the hospitals to the local football club. So I think a very important part of our work is to think that everybody has the ability to be a placemaker, and it's just about asking the right questions and helping them kind of frame their thinking in a way that enables them to create something that they want to get to together, if that makes sense.
That sounds so refreshing, and I think having been involved in lots of community engagement, stakeholder engagement processes over the years, this sounds like it's sort of stepping back, almost a step before that, taking a wider view and actually really starting from point zero and working with people up from there. At what point in the process do you come in? What sort of is there a development happening? Is it a local authority client? Like, how do you sort of get involved in these projects?
It varies, but it often is very, very early on. So at times, in fact, most often, it's probably before a master planner comes in. So East Tamil was a good example. And what we've done is continue to work with the master planning and sustainability team to then take the vision and then figure out, okay, how do we make that real? And in some ways, we also have, because we're there at that early stage, we have license to dream big before some of the technicalities come into play, right? And so it also means that we really try and push the ambition and the imagination. So in fact, our process is like, we've got a 3-step process, even if every project is different, and every place is different, and every output is different. But we always start with insight and getting people to look at their place through different eyes, and also look at the future through different eyes, start to see what signals of change might be happening. Then imagination, which I think is, to me, was the most fun part. And Domenica, you might want to speak to that in some of the work we did together, which is bringing together people's perspectives and helping them literally dream a bit bigger about what the place could be, but with a sense of depth and insight. And then finally, it's impact. It's like, how do you make that real? Which might be turning that into a series of placemaking kind of concepts, might be thinking about policy, might be thinking about kind of first steps, sometimes into meanwhile use. But yeah, very often it's before the master planner comes in, or if not, then in parallel with the master plan. And I think that's always an exciting place to be. Because you can kind of set the tone, and what's important is to say, okay, like how does that work continue on? And in fact, I think what we've found over the years is, because the nature of the scale of projects we get involved with, which is quite typical for lots of urban design, or let's say urban projects, is like generational. Like a project can take 20 to 30 years to really come to fruition. Then you've got to help share some of the skill sets, right? So it's not just about putting everything into a nice book or PDF, but it's actually about making everybody feel confident that they have the skills to take that future forward. So we've been working with the concept of futures literacy over the last couple of years, and ensuring that like some of those skills are worked into the workshops that we run. So everybody comes away going, yeah, I can do that next time. That to us is a success, I'd say, is when we can step away and say, it's yours, go for it.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Can you tell us a little bit? You've used the word futures a few times. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the world of let's say of foresight is something that's in some ways quite established. So in fact, the term futures literacy is something that has been, I don't know if it was coined by UNESCO, but certainly UNESCO have kind of backed it and they're behind it. But it's not so established in the world of urbanism to that point, right? So if you're a brand, brands often will commission studies, exploring kind of future trends. Businesses will commission scenario planning, horizon scanning. The military do that. But in an odd way, even though we're often talking with these really long-term horizons when we're thinking about the future of city, when we're thinking about cities, let's just say cities, forget the future for a moment, you're building a new district, or it's an urban regeneration project. No one is bringing that word in. And so we found a shift. Like before the pandemic, we were often trying to bring some exercises in to get people to think about what might be happening in the next 20 years and how society might be shifting. It was very hard to get anybody in let's say in a regeneration role to think about that. And then post-pandemic, it shifted. And I think a good example perhaps is when we were working about 2 years ago in Huntingdonshire, which is in the east of England. It's actually a relatively rural county, but we ran a workshop with 100 people, over 100 people, in fact, and it was focused on helping them think about the future of their region, and it took place on the hottest day, in the nation ever. It was 40 degrees outside. And in essence, nobody could deny that the future was already here, right? We have to be thinking about like different conditions when we're designing. But actually, in doing so, it doesn't mean that everything is like, it's a nightmare. We just have to figure out how to adapt. So give you a good example. In that region of Huntingdonshire, the most prevalent, let's say, like urban typology is a market town. It's really, a lot of market towns. And they said, okay, well, if our market town was predicated on a daytime economy, but now it's 40 degrees in the day, maybe we need to be thinking about a nighttime economy. So what if our nighttime economy was as strong as a daytime economy? What if we can draw on examples from Asia, where they said that, they have sort of similar climatic conditions, and learn from that. And so I thought that was a really successful kind of shift to say, okay, we understand the condition now. We understand we're in this moment of change. And we understand there are like opportunities and solutions, and we can take the best of this place and adapt it, right? So to me, was a great example of like taking futures thinking, helping us like step 20 or 30 years forward, but then like bringing it back and kind of applying it to today and rooting it in your place.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it seems since once I got introduced to the ideas of futures and futuring, it seemed so obvious, and I couldn't believe I hadn't been exposed to it before. And, in my sort of first round of education in planning and urban design, it was basically not mentioned at all. I didn't even know it existed, So, but we're dealing with these long time frames, and it's literally shaping the future. But I think we've been brought into a mindset, a sort of false sense of security that the future will be very similar to today. And of course, now we know that that's not the case at all. So yeah, fantastic work. I hope it's catching on.
I think it is, and actually, I think in my experience, like the people who within, let's say, that kind of realm, who are already thinking that way, are those who are working in sustainability. So I mean, a good example was a recent project in Cambridgeshire, and the people among all of those stakeholders who were thinking about water management were like, we have to think in 100-year time frames, right? Or the same thing in East Hemel. I think that the sustainability team who are working on that project are already thinking in those kind of longer horizons. So it's helpful that there's like more integration now. And I actually want to put a question maybe to Domenica to say, like, the idea of futures that we've been talking about is perhaps quite Western, and maybe in some of the with other cultures that we're working with, there's less of a linearity of like, this is the past and this is the future. I don't know. There might be some different ways to look at that in different parts of the world that I think are quite interesting, and are perhaps like coming into, in let's say, spreading now to different parts of the world.
Yes, I think going back, I mean, briefly with the futures, also something kind of worth to mention is the practice of futuring, and futuring has increasingly become much more collective and concerned with this idea that there is no just one future vision, which before maybe traditionally was sort of this idea that, the people, the designers, the master planners are the one making those decisions. And there were efforts to involve community, but today we can actually really see the importance of having multiple plural voices, and with the placemaking specifically, I would say that is one of the biggest kind of like roles as placemakers. So it's really understanding what are the different voices, the different communities, human, non-humans, in within the context of natural futures that are here, that are making the place the place that it is, sort of the essence. And I guess, I think going back, Rosanna, to in different, I guess, cultures, definitely there are cultures that are more, individual based and more collective in the sense that they operate. And I think that will really just sort of, I guess, depend on the different places. But definitely, I would say in sort of a shift, I guess, in kind of Western type of place making approaches or making, which is you can see exciting work in collaborative design, co-design processes, participation, from citizen science, a lot of kind of like just making things way much more decentralized, and then just acknowledging as well that there are different, even from like informal type of knowledges are quite valid in the what is informing a place. So yeah, I think it's really an exciting time for placemaking, the futures of placemaking, and just changing as well mindsets around what is informing our design and decisions.
Hi, Ross here. Just to let you know, I'm running a free webinar on the 25th of April about nature-led master planning and placemaking. I'm running this with Soham and Prachi, who are both designers and co-authors of the book Eco-Responsive Environments. We'll be getting in-depth into design strategies for delivering new places without sacrificing the environment. You can register for the webinar via the link at the bottom of the episode description. Hope to see you there. Shall we move on to talking a bit about your book, Natural Futures? So I'm very excited to hear a bit more about this. What is it? Why did you write it? What's it all about?
Sure. So we, Domenica and I, started sort of ideating, right? I think the book probably a year and a half ago. It took us about a year to write, which actually is quite a feat. I thought it would be quicker, but my understanding of time, despite the fact I work with time, is really bad. Anyway, but the book really is a collective effort. It's a collection of essays, of case studies, and of provocations, focused on reframing our relationship with nature. And it asked the question: if nature was your partner in placemaking, how would you design differently? What would you do differently? But the book is not just a book for designers, and I think that's an important point, because our concept of placemakers is very broad, right? We might define a kid on a beach with a bucket and spade as a placemaker, or a market trader as a placemaker, as well as a city mayor or an urbanist. And so the intention is that if we all have a relationship with nature, we're all able to have access to it, we all have a relationship with place, we should be able to bring the two together to consider, where the places we care about are heading and how we can conceive of them differently. That's a quick kind of prelude. It's a 300 pages. It takes you on a bit of a whirlwind tour around the world. I mean, maybe Domenica, you want to talk about some of the places that we go.
Yeah. And also to mention the as well, because we have, maybe it could be worth mentioning the sort of the chapters in the sense that it kind of emerged a combination between the Rosanna, sort of like what you were already noticing from your work. So it's kind of like on the ground up, like the concerns around the future of our places in relation to sort of the natural very broadly. So I think the conversation around topics emerging that way, as well as what we were seeing and noticing from our own research. So that was kind of a little bit how it was sort of the chapters that we emerged. So we have sort of main chapters around the first one, Nature Our Neighbor, which is in the context of sort of like urban cities, the future of the green future of our cities. Radical Ruralism, second chapter, and just taking a look at more sort of countryside and kind of like maybe sort of, what is not the city, but of course I think we within the book we acknowledge sort of that divide that has been constructed in our ideas, and of course that has created different perceptions of how we perceive them and how we inhabit those spaces. Another chapter on coastlines specifically. Rosanna have done already a bunch of work with coastline. So it's coastlines on the cusp. Another one, nature-based innovation, and this is really, I think, a fascinating one because innovation, in the sense we really speak about, sort of, it can even be a way of operating within society. It could be sort of like a cultural innovation. So it's really not the focus on kind of like the, like a tech or techno fixes. It's really about really broadening the topic of what is innovation, weathering the storm, and this is kind of of course, how actually weather and climate change is impacting sort of land territories, but also again how people, I think in this chapter is we wanted to make it a little bit of course hopeful. These conversations tend to be quite difficult. I mean, I guess when you read them, quite gloomy, but we really wanted to see how are people responding to this in a positive, hopeful way that is actually in a way giving them they're proactive and actually trying to enact change within their community. So that one is a good chapter. And then we have the final chapter, Towards Living as Nature, and this is really about that paradigm shift and again doing more justice to other ways of being in the world and thinking about the world, sort of, so different ways of knowing, and this is kind of a little bit exploring indigenous culture, folk knowledges, so it's really place-based rooted knowledges. So this is kind of a little bit how the chapters were divided. I would say that, of course, because it's so ambitious, these topics in themselves can be books, right? Yeah. So I think that our approach was really, as as a book for placemakers, as you mentioned, Rosanna, like anyone can be a placemaker. So this book could be really, designers, but also, writers, researchers, and anyone can pick it up, really. But it's really about kind of like provocations, sort of a little bit of case studies, a mix of actionable steps. So really hoping people can take forward something from that. We also give examples of tools we have used as well within processes. So it kind of gives you an idea about what can you do in your own sort of work or sphere. I don't know, Rosanna, if you want to pick on the button here.
Yeah, no, I suppose a final comment on that is I think that a lot of our work is enabling people to reframe their place, right? And to reframe the mindset that we believe you don't always have to be building something or growing something. Sometimes you just need to take a fresh view on the place that you know and approach it with a different perspective. And to your point, Domenica, it's also useful to bring in other perspectives to help you to do that. And I think that's really what this book is trying to do, to help you to change mindset and think, and which in our experience is having since gone to many conferences that that relate to this subject of like nature and urbanism. We're hearing that a lot of people are saying we have the technical solutions. What we really need to establish is a mindset shift and a culture shift, and then establish that what the tools are for us to be able to bring this new culture or new way of being into practice. And that's what we're really trying to do through the book, is to kickstart that conversation.
Amazing. There's loads to explore there, and I think maybe a good entrance point will be, we won't be able to cover everything, but I'll have a link for people to go and check it out themselves on your website. But maybe a good entrance point is this chapter on Nature Our Neighbour, about urban areas. What's some of the sort of ideas that are in there?
Yeah, no, that's a great one to start, and I think really relevant to your listeners. So, I mean, the first to say that the most of our thinking has emerged, as Domenica said, twofold. One is from the conversations that we have with the many, many people that we encounter, the work that we do. And the second is how we kind of, reframe that and back that up with our research. And so we started to look within that chapter at specifically that kind of, that perspective. One of the opening lines is by the landscape architect Anne Whiston Spurn, who I think teaches landscape architecture at MIT. And she says the language of landscape is our native language. But she talks about the fact that as we have moved, let's say, from being, humankind surrounded by nature into cities, we've kind of lost the ability, as our lives have become less and less green and less natural, less and less blue. We've forgotten how to speak that language. And certainly you do see that, like, as an urban dweller, you build your own kind of vocabulary, but it's very much based on what's around you. And what we're there, so that what we're starting to say is, well, like, if we reframed, the squirrel running up the tree, or the I suppose it's or the flower growing here, or the tree growing here, i.e. like a kind of more than human world as our neighbor, if we saw them as some living entity that we live alongside, how would we treat that differently? And what we start to look at is, in that chapter, are the fact that there's actually some, beyond this nature city disconnect, there are some incredible projects taking place. So we start to look at them actually at different scales. So I've been lucky enough to work on a number of large scale projects, a few in the US actually, which is quite interesting, like the Brickline Greenway in St. Louis, Missouri, which is an incredible project that crisscrosses the city. We're talking, I think it's 20 kilometers of greenways with nature kind of threaded throughout, as an example. And often those kind of large-scale projects, have the ability to make a generational impact, but it doesn't have to always, work in that way. So we kind of go from the large all the way down to the extra small of, like, what can you do on your window box, if that makes sense? Like, how can we kind of look at that in a tiny way, knowing that we can't all necessarily get involved, and how can perhaps what happens on your doorstep help repair some of those broken relationships? Number one. So that's some of the kind of key. But then there's also the flip side, and actually this came out of a conversation I had with an urbanist in the States, James Lima, who does a lot of work around social justice in cities. And he said, okay, green is great, but how do we avoid some of the challenges around, like, gentrification, around kind of who gets access to green, right? And there's some pretty shocking statistics across the world as to, in essence, to put it, simply, the wealthier neighborhoods in London, you see this a lot, wealthier neighborhoods, wealthier families have greater access to green space. So how do we kind of look at that? So we also explore some good examples in Barcelona, for instance, with Aquí, who are a collective we've been working with in that city, looking at modes of sort of ecological spatial justice, like how you can design parks, green spaces that invite people in from lots of different backgrounds with lots of different interests and activities, and how they can kind of bring people together. And the fact that you can't really create sustainable places if social justice is not there as an underpinning. They're going to, in essence, they're going to trip themselves up, right, for the longer term. Put it that way. So those are some of the elements. Ella, is there this idea of just sustainability? Is there anything else that, Domenica, you want to kind of bring up, especially about the non-human, which could be interesting here?
Yes. In the book, we've highlighted special interventions that support multi-species justice, which is about advocating for the recognition and the rights of our other-than-human neighbors. For instance, the project The Architecture of Multi-Species Cohabitation by the collective Feral Partnerships shows us through installation work the more-than-human perspectives in contemporary architecture. And this is the type of work that we're seeing today, which is about how do we begin to take different perspectives in the way that we are designing, in the way that we are inhabiting spaces and places. So this exercise of shifting the human perspective into possibly the perspective of a different life form, let that be a plant, an animal, soil itself, helps us to expand the way that we, design, but also consider other actors at play in the spaces that we're creating. And this is a very useful thing to do. We also see the importance of
expanding our language in the way that we describe our places, because eventually that will help us understand places in a particular way. So, for instance, the metaphor of a sponge city has helped city planners consider the urban water ecological environment, and sort of understanding that more of a sort of system of water circulation. And for instance, we see from the work of restoration ecologist Jake Robinson, who encourages us to think about our cities as microbiomes in a way so that we can think about all the invisible life that makes up our entire ecosystem. So metaphors like this are also very, very useful to embrace a more than human conception of our places. So yeah.
I think there's actually, to me, just up to one point, Ross, is one of the most interesting contrasts in that chapter are the two contributions that we have. One is from the team at McGregor Coxall, who are biourbanists, who are in essence landscape architects, but have coined this term and actually put a lot of research behind it, of looking at a biome, city as a biome, and the scale of that, which is huge. And then contrasting that with a short, like an interview with Dr. Jake Robinson, who's a microbial ecologist, microbial restoration ecologist, and looking at the stuff you don't see. And I think this is an interesting way to highlight just how how much there is surrounding us, the very big, the very small, which highlights the scale of the challenge ahead, right, as well.
I love that. I think there's so many great strategies for, implementing more vegetation, promoting more habitats within cities. But I think it has to go back as well to our deep cultural beliefs about what nature within our city should be. And I think so much of this is based on really, Victorian ideals of tidying everything up and sort of humans' sort of control of nature, and domination over nature within a designed environment. And unfortunately, that was exported around the world through empire, basically. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of undoing those perspectives, which are purely cultural and in that sense not tied to a physical reality in terms of this is how parks need to be. And I wonder, will a changing climate start to shift people's perspective on what their local park should look like when it starts to dry out every summer? When trees start to really struggle and need to be, felled or start falling down due to drought, will people really come around to the idea that actually we could embrace a much wilder and more resilient form of nature? I don't know. That's a hope. That's a hope I have.
but I think it's a really astute point of view, and one of the reasons that the book is really global in its perspective is that we've been, again, lucky enough to have conversations with people who live and work in very different parts of the world, from Snæfellsnes in Iceland, which is a maritime peninsula a couple of hours outside of Reykjavik, to Jaisalmer in Rajasthan, which is a city in the middle of the Thar Desert. And their perspectives have, highlight that there are very different ways of living with nature, and actually very different ways of living in climates that people think of as very harsh, but with abundance. So a good example, actually, in Jaisalmer, we interviewed Shaheen Hassan, who runs the I Love Jaisalmer Foundation, and really that's what she talks about. How traditional practices in the Thar Desert mean that you can live with an abundance of food in a place that people would look at as very barren. In a similar way, the work we've done in Iceland, in Snæfellsnes, we were working with the regional park, which was actually the Europe's first EarthCheck destination. So they've got a kind of understanding of nature embedded in their psyche, in their culture, because there's almost no other choice. 4,000 people living in an enormous landscape. You got to figure out how to relate to it. It's bigger than, there's more nature than people. And one of the things they talk about, or Ragnhildur, who's the regional park manager who we work very closely with, it is, the brutality of that landscape, but how alive it is. And at the end of the interview, she talks about the fact that sometimes when she's feeling a little low, she just goes out and lifts her jacket into the wind and like gathers all the energy from that, harsh climate, and it recharges her. And so it's this magnetic energy that can be, they describe it as a magnetic energy that can be seen, felt, and heard, that actually gives them a new lease of life. So I think it's a great reminder to your point, Ross, like we have many different ways to live with nature, and we just need to look. The future's always taking place somewhere else. What can we learn if we collaborate? Back to Domenica's point.
I'd love to talk a little bit about this radical ruralism point and about sort of dissolving that divide between the urban and the rural. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, because I think I've been guilty of thinking those as quite separate realms. And as I've been studying more ecology and trying to understand these things more, I'm realizing actually it's all very fluid, although it doesn't often seem that way. So I don't know, any thoughts on that?
Actually, radical ruralism was as a sort of term or title, was something that I've been pondering on for the last couple of years, and it started because again, the conversations I was having, the projects that were emerging for us, were often the most innovative thinking was happening in a rural environment, right? And so I was like, okay, there's something here, but often the focus of urbanists is on cities. So sometimes that's even just like, where's the gaze, and what we we felt it was necessary to highlight, join the dots on some of these incredible rural projects that were happening, and start to look also at the realities of okay, what's rural life like? I mean, for instance, even though it's not in that chapter, but some of the work we did with Ragnhildur and her team and the 5 municipalities, of which, I mean, we're talking about 100 or so, 100, 200 people living, in a village together in rural Snaefell's Nest, gave us an example of okay, how, what rural life was like in that instance, and how many hats people had to wear when nature was around them. So we started to realize, okay, there's some very different conditions that you're kind of working with. But I think one of the most important elements here is that there's often especially when you're talking about futures, an argument that runs, okay, the world is urbanizing fast. That's going to be the future, right? That's one perspective. But if your cities do not have access to energy, if your cities do not have access to food, if your cities do not have access to nature, because you see it as kind of something separate, then in essence, your cities are going to die. And there's a very nice quote actually from Hannah Loftus, who is an urbanist who does a lot of rural work at the beginning. And she says, cities depend on rural areas. We feed you. Your electricity comes from our turbines, our reactors and our land. Our rocks are mined to give you smartphones. So we have to sort of reverse the trend and listen to what our unheard voices have to say. And so what we start to look at in this chapter is actually the fact that rural places have long been a hotbed of radical thinking, of innovative thinking, especially in terms of spatial politics. We look at everything from UK rave culture through to actually land movements in Mexico, and start to say that there's been an underpinning here in relation to things like farming, like the radical roots of regenerative farming, which was in the La Via Campesina movement in Latin America, as an example, and how that's sort of informing things today. So we took, back to your point around culture, we start to look at this idea of rural culture and the fact that if you just look a little deeply, it's always been a place for amazing thinking. And some of the case studies of some of the places we go to include places like Dun, which is a settlement about 30 in a rural area, but it's about half an hour from Jaipur. And the team at Dun have been incredible as they have been working to revive a piece of relatively barren land where the soil had been stripped due to floods and the kind of sorts of classic farming practices that had taken place on that land afterwards. And they spent 10 years restoring the landscape. In fact, drawing some of the more traditional practices from places like the Thar Desert, which traditionally have a much, much harsher climate than that part of than the area outside Jaipur. So they kind of took from one area, applied that thinking and that knowledge to another, and have been reviving this landscape to create a kind of regenerative community. And so again, it's like these are interestingly the places where the most experimental thinking is happening. What can cities learn from them, and how can we start to reframe the role of rural? And maybe in the future, will that divide even exist? You know, if cities are becoming greener and rural areas and potentially are becoming more habitable or more inhabited, like, is it, you know, and technology might enable us to work anywhere. Is that just going to be a totally irrelevant construct? Which I don't have the answer, but
anything from you, Domenica, on that?
In rural places, we also see the important role of education, specifically in the context of the ecological crisis, a very interdisciplinary and future-oriented type of education. So, for instance, the Black Mountains College in Talgarth in Wales is specifically teaching a very interdisciplinary approach to environmental, ecological disciplines that combine, for instance, the skills in restoration, land management, but also integrating that with, creative approaches from art and design to teach a much more holistic systems look into, our environments. And alongside this types of formal education, there are different expressions of bringing the education and learning outdoors. You have forest schools where it's bringing children outdoors to learn more hands-on skills and ways of being outside and engaging with the environment around them. And we also have these types of kind of learning experiences, combining spirituality and ecology, in which people, mainly from urban sites, they go and immerse themselves in natural places and environments as a way to reconnect with the natural environment that perhaps they are missing from their urban environments. So in a way, the physicality and the tangibility and the directedness, connectedness that these places in rural sites afford is very important in the either learning process, but also in the process of reconnecting oneself with our environments, basically.
It's really interesting. I think I've recently moved, or a couple of months ago, I moved to northern Italy, and I'm living just outside Milan. I'm living essentially in a bit of a commuter town, but very different to what you might think of as a commuter town in the UK, in that it's has a metro station that brings you straight into Milan, and it's sort of quite a dense, sort of all apartment blocks, 4 to 6 stories. It's not like suburbia like I would be used to from the UK and Ireland. And it's been very interesting because there's all these towns that are sort of little pockets of sort of dense urban living. And then it's just intertwined with all these agricultural fields. And there might be just like, you can walk along the canal and there'll just be, apartment buildings. And then suddenly there'll just be a field of corn. And then another block of apartment buildings. And you can get out into the countryside really quickly on these walking trails between the paths or between the fields and connect up to these other towns. And it's just like, it's the kind of like best practice stuff that you would see in like really cutting edge master plans in the UK, but they did it in like the 1970s in Italy because it was just like, for whatever reason, I don't really know why. And it's just been such an interesting perspective for me to just see how you can live in the benefits of the urban, but having the being able to see the Alps in the distance and seeing food being produced within 5 minutes of your home has been so interesting.
I think again, it goes back to culture in an interesting way, because culture drives how you take decisions. So, I mean, I'm half 3/4 Italian, but knowing like the role that food takes, in Italian culture is essential. And in a lot of places in the south of Europe, whether that's Greece or Spain, a lot of people I know who live in city centres have an ability to grow food, or have a connection to a small piece of land that they own, or their parents or grandparents own outside the city, where they go and grow stuff, right? And so they'll be like, oh yeah, these are the olives I've grown on my piece of land. You've got to have some of my granddad's olive oil. Or these are the lemons I grew on my rooftop. And so I think, again, it's like if what you value culturally, it drives your decisions, you design differently. And I think this is a really important point that that's almost the point of the book, right? It is saying, well, what does that culture shift need to take? But it's a great example, Russ.
I'm mindful of the time, but I'm really enjoying the conversation, so I'm going to try and hold on to you for a bit longer. Can we touch a bit on coastal futures, that chapter, which I think is really, really relevant for cities and rural communities?
Yeah, rural coastal futures emerged, and we describe it as coastlines on the cusp in the book, partly through a personal passion. I mean, I grew up on the coast in the UK, the South Coast. And actually, over the pandemic, I moved back to the South Coast and started to realize, I suppose you take the difference, in life and lifestyle, and the connection that people had. That was really fascinating. But we have been working throughout the lifespan of the Place Bureau on many waterside or coastal projects. And as we started to develop deeper research into this, we realized really how precarious their futures are. So Domenica and I were working last year on a project in Bristol, at Temple Quarter. And I think, Domenica, you started to look into some of the flood risks, the realities of that in already quite a rainy city, let's face it, which is going to be, again, live a very different climate in the next kind of 20 years. And that is not, that's not on a global level, that's not really extreme. If you start to look at big cities like Miami, Shanghai, New York, the flood risk that they're facing is enormous. Now, often that's seen in real estate terms. And in some ways, that's fine, because it actually, if that's going to drive a new conversation, then fantastic. But the crazy thing about the coastline is we're still drawn to it. And so, in fact, I think that the opening line of that chapter is, coast is that water is magnetic, and that's a problem. Like, it seems crazy. Like, why would you live next to something that you know is going to flood, that you know is going to cause you a problem, but it's still so attractive? And so what we try to unpack is our emotional, cultural, historical connection to the sea, right? And why we kind of can't stay away from it, and all the benefits. There are health benefits, there are mental health benefits, especially. I think one of the interesting things in the chapter that we explore, and again, we started to see this emerging through our work, was the sheer creativity, however, of coastal communities. And my kind of hypothesis is that when you live by the coastline, you're used to really dramatic change on a day-to-day basis. Storm blows in one day, super calm the next day, as an example, right? Or, you're running something on the beachfront, you get great weather one day, and then you get a bad year the next year, and you need to figure out how to adapt. So there's much more kind of adaptability on those coastlines. Things are much more temporary. People are also often, if you think about port cities, used to very multicultural kind of communities. So there's an ability to be really agile, and a kind of need to think, creatively about adaptation. And I think that's innate in a lot of coastal dwellers. And so we start to look at that and what that means for future technology. So one of the projects that we have been working on is a concept with an artist in Karachi in Pakistan, Taki Shaheen. And for the intent is to create a digital museum of coastal futures, with the idea being that coastal dwellers around the world have a lot in common with each other, and actually can share knowledge both of their rootedness, their kind of past stories of the place, their current problems, and then, feel equipped with, let's say, futures literacy skills to think about how they could create their future stories. And somebody in Karachi might have more in common with somebody in somebody in Karachi might have more in common with somebody in Southampton or in Cork in Ireland than they do with those living inland. And in fact, through the process of the project, I was in the South Coast in Bournemouth, Southampton, and Taki in Karachi, and he found this historical connection, this historical migration route from the Indian subcontinent into the UK was Karachi to Southampton line. So he went back into the archives and found all this old material that highlighted that. But in essence, we think that the creativity, let's say, of coastal dwellers also shows that it's a place to start developing solutions, right, for how we can live and how we can adapt. And we explore a whole series of those in the book. Like, how can we encourage new, blue economies? How can we support sea wilding? And there's some fantastic work happening, a lot of it actually around the south of the UK. In doing so. So the coastal futures for us is really important. Like, one of the key projects we worked on has been in the Isle of Wight over the last year, in the Bay Area specifically. And now we're in conversations with them about how we can help them to imagine a new future for that island, which in itself is a UNESCO biosphere. How can island life, become self-sustaining, and take all of the fantastic assets of that place as a way to counter some of the really difficult realities of coastal living day to day as well.
I love this as a sort of positive. We hear a lot about sea level rise and the way that will impact, and is already starting to impact, a lot of coastal communities. And I think stepping away for a moment from the sort of doom and seriousness of that, and actually taking a step back and thinking, well, can we as a community come together and come up with what might look like a positive future for us in a reality of rising sea levels, increased flooding, etc., I think is absolutely essential. And I hope this is something that, more people can do and get the tools to do. Yeah,
and so it's to your point, it's the sharing of that knowledge and those tools that for us is important, and working at how that adapts to your local condition and your local environment. But again, there's some very strong typologies of coastal communities around the world that have a hell of a lot in common with each other. And just because they're in different geographies or nation states doesn't mean that they shouldn't share that.
Yeah, totally. Anything from you, Domenica?
Yeah, the chapter on coastal futures, I think is one of the most challenging ones, because this is sort of the chapter where you can actually you can see the impact that climate change has on communities, on the land, and of course, I mean, it has a destructive characteristic and impact on different life forms. And what we try to do with this chapter was highlighting the hope, but also the resilience of different communities in tackling challenges around, specifically on coastal cities. And we thought that was very hopeful and innovative. So, for instance, there's this project specifically happening in Japan, and it's sort of this relationship between the sea, the village, but also the forest. So it's kind of like a beautiful combination within these three relationships, and there is this NGO, Odyssey Nature Japan, that is focused specifically on environmental education, works with children, but also with the local people in the area, how they are managing and keeping the forest so that eventually it supports the sea as well, and it's very hands-on and program and this notion of developing a respectful relationship with nature. So what I liked about this project is, there is an acknowledgement from the people that they talk about kind of a generational gap, that the younger generations, they don't know how to necessarily sort of how to keep, sustain the land, or all these different knowledges that are present in the land, but also in the people that maintain a particular land. And I think in here the what is hopeful is that it's kind of like trying to close that generational gap and bringing together different generations through, again, the lens of education. And I think this is sort of actions that they are actually quite impactful, because it really puts people in the position of taking whatever level of action they do. But again, this even if they are micro actions, they have ripple effects. So yes, we are very, very encouraged to see the different interventions across this chapter.
Let's finish up with a discussion on the Collaborative Place Futures Toolkit, because if I'm right, and tell me if I'm wrong, this is maybe a way that people can start to think about practical ways of implementing some of these ideas, working with communities. So yeah, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. So the toolkit has been drawn from the many, many projects and workshops that we have developed with very different types of, geographies, landscapes, cities around the world. And through that process, we realized that there was a need for, as Domenica said, communities, stakeholders to be able to skill up and be able to take, that collaborative approach through the life or the development of a place, which might take 20, 30 years. What we've done is we've designed this in such a way that it can be used by, on a street level through to a regional level. So as a good example, somebody recently bought the toolkit who said, I'm looking to use this with my 3-year-old daughter to figure out if we should be living in this neighborhood in the future, through to us working on entire regions like Cambridgeshire and Peterborough with the mayors of those of those major cities. It follows like a process that's a 4-step process, but in essence, there's a lot of freedom to pick the right tools. And they're very playful in a way that suits your project. But the first step is empathy, which for us is super important, and that's both empathy with each other, the other people around the table, but also empathy with the place. And so, empathy with nature around you is a big part of that. And then insight, how you can spot signals of change in your neighborhood, but also those happening around the world, and think about the impact on your place. So you feel well informed, in essence, to take the right decisions. Then there's the imagination, right, which is really key. And we bring in techniques like a world building blueprint from the world of filmmaking, which is great at helping us dream, about bigger stories. And I think if you look at that at the moment, filmmaking and gaming are fantastic ways to help us live in the future, inhabit that future, try it on for size, and then come back and see if we like it. And then the final important stage is impact. Is like, how do we take collective decisions about which of those future worlds we want to, bring into being, and how do we turn that into action? So the toolkit offers you over 30 different techniques to make that happen. And actually, alongside the toolkit, we've also been working with a team at the School of Critical Design to develop a Place Futures online course, which is self-guided. So there's a number of different ways to pick up some of these skills if you've listened to this and you're interested in it, whether that's learning online and being part of that online community, picking up a pack of cards, the toolkit, and trying out with your kids, as somebody did, or with your mayor. Or alternatively, finding ways to. We do also work on a bespoke level with different communities to help them kind of take this forward. But I think I was thinking back about this, and actually one of the nice things is really that we discovered through this research is that change is happening on a local level first. That's where the innovation is. So and that change starts with reimagining your beach or your woodland or your park or your field, not as yours, not as places that belong to us, but rather places we belong to. And I think this notion within this context of natural futures is collaborating, with the world around you, with nature, will totally shift. Try emphasize and see how you might kind of shift the way that you think about where you live or you work or you play, and how you're part of that.
Amazing. I love that. Domenica, any final thoughts from you on that?
Yes, just to quickly add on that, one of the great things about the toolkit is that it was designed from a very participatory, collaborative engagement type of practice. So and also it emphasizes the role of creativity and design practices. So it's very, very kind of evocative to the imagination, and also, as Rosanna mentioned, kind of tools that are used in film, world building, for instance, and gaming. So in a way, and that is the very interesting thing about thinking about places. It's just not something that you kind of plan on a desk, which yes, but also in the process of thinking through those stages is also immersing ourselves in the places themselves, and as you mentioned, Rosanna, emphasizing with the different actors within a place, and now if we're trying to develop a more ecocentric approach to placemaking, how might we empathize with our other than human neighbors as well. So again, here creative practices are very, very important to support that process, that imagination process, and eventually, yes, it does help in the articulation of what we want to do. Again, all these different methods and approaches are meant to be used in together with other processes, so it's complementary to different stages in the planning and development of different places.
And actually, Ross, because you're in Italy, we've actually translated the toolkit into Italian and into Spanish, because we believe that it should be used around the world. So if anyone else has any other languages they want it translated into, let us know.
Might help me with my Italian language learning. I'll get the English and the Italian version side by side. Exactly.
We'll send you a copy, no worries.
That's great, guys. Thank you so much. I'm really, really excited by this work, and I find it really refreshing and inspiring. The links, just for people listening, I'll put links to all of that stuff. The book, the Collaborative Place Futures Toolkit, in the episode description, so you can go and check that stuff out. And I think we're kind of ready to wrap up, but I just want to give you guys a chance to any parting words of wisdom or any calls to action for the listeners.
Oh, parting words of wisdom. I'm not sure how wise I feel, but thanks, Russ. I think for me, especially within this world that can be so focused on the built, environment, it's to understand the power of of culture, right? And how different that is in different local settings. In actually being, it's like the soft power really behind what you do. And I think that's really what Natural Futures is to some extent about. It's like trying to redefine, cultural value around nature. So don't forget that, because I think a lot of our work is looking at cultural shifts and how they really drive what you build or what you plan, what you design, what you grow. Yeah.